what they did to us. We are what we chose to become after. Fade to black.